Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this seminar in the series, the Department of Philosophy seminar series. This is the penultimate series for this seminar for this year. I'll give you more information at the end about the next events of the department. But today, this evening, it's a pleasure to welcome back at our department two colleagues from the University of Torino, Tiziana, Andina, and Carola Barbero, who were both here just a couple of years ago, 2 years ago.
For me, it was just last year.
Last year,
Yeah.
exactly, two. Right.
And me 2 years.
And 2 years ago, who will be giving their talks in this seminar. The titles are similar, but the topics are different. So Professor Andina will first be speaking about traces of future, and a slight surprise, because there's a change in Professor Barbero's talk. It will be about the traces of meaning, right? I'll just to introduce our very welcome speakers. Tiziana Andina is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Torino. She was a fellow at Columbia University, Kate Hamburger colleague in Bonn, and a visiting professor at ITMO University in Russia, and in many other universities. She's authored many articles on Italian and international journals on different topics of philosophy, social ontology, and aesthetics. Her most recent publications concern precisely social ontology, and her latest book is A Philosophy for Future Generations, the Structure and Dynamics of Transgenerationality. Professor Barbero, on the other hand, is teaches philosophy as well of language and philosophy of literature at the University of Torino, and her research interests includes entity names, metaphysics and ontology of fictional entities, emotions, and several other areas joining literary and language. She was a visiting researcher at the University of Auckland, at ETH Zurich, and she's the author of, as well, of many essays and articles published in journals. And her most recent one, That Shiver in the Back, The Language of Literature, was published in Italian with Il Mulino in 2023. So welcome to both. It's a real pleasure to have you here. We'll proceed in this way. So Professor Andina will give her presentation. Professor Barbero will follow, and then there will have time for a discussion at the end, so that we keep the flow of the conversation there without having to interrupt the discussion halfway through. Professor
Thank you
Andina,
very much.
the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to discuss my research with you. So I try to add some different points and some different reflection to a topic which I presented here 2 years ago, and on this topic, which is, by the way, the notion of transgenerationality and the idea of using transgenerationality for the future, for conceive a future society. I try to add some more observation and some more points to that talk. This is a research project, a national research project we are trying to develop in Italy. And this is just to explain to you the kind of works we are doing about the idea of future, the idea of future society, and the idea of future generation. It's a research group who is working from different perspectives on this notion, and we are a group made by philosophers, especially theoreticians, lawyers, and sociologists. Okay, so all these things put together, I think, make us more in a more convenient position to try to explain what transgenerationality is and why is important for our society and our, I would say, democracy to better understand the notion of future generation and how it's possible to think about the way in which we can think to future generation. So why I titled my talk Traces of Future, because future is an interesting notion for the social ontologists. Most of them are interested in the present. So we say in philosophy that the most shared view is the presentism. So the fact that we try to explain how society works and how society are built in a sort of paradigmatic way from the point of view of the present. So the future is an interesting, I would say, condition for the social ontologist and something which intrigues social ontologists. One interesting starting point is a contemporary reflection made by Europe about the way in which future generation can be used in law and also in our contemporary treatise. The Maastricht Principle on Human Rights of Future Generation is a very recent way in which European Union tried to face the problem of future and the problem of future generation for contemporary society. The Maastricht Principle on Human Rights of Future Generation, which was delivered in 2022, seek to clarify the present state of international law as it is applied to the human rights of future generation. This means that European Union tried to put on the table the fact that future generation must be protected in some way, and European law must to face the question of protecting the future through the notion of future generation. The principle consolidates developing of legal framework and affirm binding obligation of European states and other actors as prescribed under international and human rights law. This principle provides a progressive interpretation and development of existing human rights standards. So the starting point is that of using the standard notion of human rights and try to enlarge this view using the notion of future generation in the context of human rights of future generation, as I told you. They further recognize that states might incur additional obligation as human rights law continues to evolve. Why it's really important from, especially in this particular historical moment, to face the question of the future in the perspective of social ontology, political philosophy, and I would also add moral philosophy. Because a lot of challenges of contemporary society have to face the question of the future and the question of particular problem which must be faced in a long-term perspective. I would just to mention some of them, but you can easily recall this problem. Climate and environmental crisis, for example, land protection, energies, policies, food, sustainability, and so on and so forth, sustainability of welfare system, pension, health, and education, and last but not least, the question of sovereignty of future generation, which means the problem of guaranteeing for future people the same rights and the same not only the same obligation, but also the same rights that the present people the present people have. So this means this can be labeled the question of transgenerational sovereignty, which involve political freedom for every generation. All these topics, but you can easily add a lot of other topics, can be faced only if you put the individual or the institution or the states in the position of considering each of them from the perspective of future. Political and moral philosopher describe this kind of condition as a sort of chain of generation, in order to explain that each individual is linked on the both side, on the side of the future and on the side of the past. This is the more or less the agenda of our research project. So I would just to mention some of these points. We try to define transgenerationality, which means we try to define how this bond between generations can be described. We try to explain a much more enlarged ontology, putting different prolegomena at the basis of our ontology in order to make this ontology useful to explain how this link between different generations can be explained. And then we can apply this different ontology to other spheres of philosophy, which means ethics, politics, and obviously applied disciplines, which means not philosophy at all, but, for example, law and sociology and so on and so forth. So before entering into the question of the notion of future generation, which is the topics of the today's speech, I want just to refresh the idea of transgenerationality, which I already presented to you 2 years ago. What does we mean for transgenerationality, and what does philosophers mean for transgenerationality? This is a very provisional definition, but I think this is a definition that in some sense can be used. We use the concept of transgenerationality to give concrete content to the idea of the generational change, which I mentioned before. So to the idea that each generation is linked to the present, to the past one, and to the future one, and generation are unit by a double bond, a biological and a social one. The idea I want to stress here is that the chain of generation includes a number of subjects: past generation that exist and no longer exist, present generation that are at least partially equivalent to the active constituencies of a civitas. I will explain what I mean for a civitas in the last part of the presentation. And future generation that do not exist, at least not in the same way as the present generation do. So you have, broadly speaking, 3 different kinds of subjects and 3 different kinds of entities, I would say. Present people, present generation, who are the person who can make political decision, obviously, and that can have political representation in the actual democracy. Past people, who are the ancestor, who are a part of this chain, not something which simply disappear, and future one, which are constantly asked to participate in some sense to the kind of action that, or some kind of particular action that present generation decide. So our ontology is a little is quite quite larger than the standard basic ontology. How we can, this is the other question that I want to discuss with you, how we can base or how we can offer foundation, an ontological foundation to a society which is conceived over the time and not just in the present. In order to substantiate the idea of chain of generation, which technically speaking can be described as transgenerationality, we need to reformulate the standard ontology, the standard social ontology, by introducing time as a determining element. So we have to put the notion of time at the center of the classical social ontology, the standard social ontology. The notion of processuality will allow us to add a type of social action to the standard types of cooperative social action, which are very, very well described by authors like Margaret Gilbert or Tuomela or also John Searle, for example, and to formulate some consideration regarding the concept of future generation. So in order to enlarge the basic idea of cooperative social action, which you can find, for example, in Walking Together by Margaret Gilbert, just to make a reference, you have to basically modify some part of the classical social ontology. And I am trying to suggest how this is possible. You have to enrich your social ontology, including in the social ontology also entities which are not existing entity in space and time, for example, which is a problematic thing to do, but I think that it is something that is very helpful if you want to completely change the way in which we classical conceive the society, and in the way in which we can also change the way in which we consider our democracy. So new kind of collective action, the first move is that of introducing new kind of collective action plus the ordinary one. And we call this kind of action transgenerational social action, and new kind of subjects in order to explain this kind of action. So these new subjects for the realization are useful in order to explain the realization of long-term social action, which means kind of action which endure for a long time. And this entity is precisely the notion of the unborn. So the standard story of action is the story which was mentioned and which was told by Margaret Gilbert, but also by Bratman, for example. And what does this story tell in order to explain the structure of social action? First of all, they conceive, both theorists, which means Gilbert and Bratman, they conceive human as planners, as rational agents, which are able of planning or planify or to construct a planification of their way of aging, first of all. As planners, we have two abilities: to act purposefully and to articulate and explain the plan we made. Our ability to articulate plans that extend into the future is based essentially on two elements. Human can be rational. We are undoubtedly not rational in every circumstance, but we can have a rational way of conceiving our present and future action. and they also have the ability to coordinate their action to achieve a complex goal. So we can coordinate our action with other agents, we can planify this, and we can planify also the future of our agency. The plans we develop are only partial and are updated according to our needs and circumstances. This margin of incompleteness that characterize plans is of primary importance because it creates the condition for the practical reasoning that is typical of planning agents, or at least we hope. Reasoning that takes the initial and partial plans as data and aims to implement them by devising appropriate means and carrying out preliminary steps. This is the way in which rational agents usually try to planificate their future way of intervening in the world. What we can add to this pretty standard story? The point we are not considering in the story which I mentioned, and which was very well described by Gilbert, for example, is the fact that in order to planificate in a very articulate way this kind of collaborative action, we need not only present people, but we also need, especially for particular kind of those action, also future people, or at least the idea of these future people. So when we planificate, we construct a sort of planification of this action, we make a reference to this concept. The point we are not considering in that story is the following. In long-term cooperative action, rational subjects imply cooperation between different generations to complete this action. So we imply in this kind of collaborative action the collaboration of people which are which emerge from the history, I would say, at some point in the history. In many cases, they even postulate a cooperation with subjects not yet born. This means that agents postulate cooperation that cannot be synchronous with entities that do not exist. Rational agents imagine that such entity can become part of the action by choosing to cooperate in an action project initiated by them. Okay? And this is very intriguing because we are not in the position, or at least not in the position that philosopher would ask, for example, to explain the characteristic of those entities, to explain of the properties of those entities which we imply in our shared agency. So we can describe this particular kind of action, and in the way in which I'm trying to offer to you now. The transgenerational social action to be accomplished required the necessary collaboration between people belonging to different generations. Moreover, only some people of group, typically those who decide to take social action, have decided on the action. So the decision is of starting the collaborative action is completely on the side of the starting subjects, I would say, of the present people. The model of transgenerational social action captures a level of collaboration between generations that is necessary in certain circumstances to perform complex and particularly articulated social action. The theoretical crux of transgenerational social action lies in the fact that successive generations completing the transgenerational action generally do not have the opportunity to give prior consent to the action. This is the reason why this particular kind of action is not of the same time of the collaborative action which I mentioned, which was described by Gilbert and Bratman, for example. The critical point of this action is that the generation deciding on transgenerational action cannot require others, in many cases future generation, to consent to the action. The material impossibility, however, does not exclude that from an ethical point of view, this type of action, if taken, should not involve taking special precaution for future generations. So as you can see, we use that kind of future, making some expectation and considering some rights and future for this kind of quite obscure entities. But these entities are in some sense necessary if we want to make this kind of action. So just to recap the definition, transgenerational action are those actions that require the necessary cooperation between two or more different generations to complete the action. So what we can say about this kind of entity we are, in fact, we have in fact already introduced in our ontologies, because this is my point. We, as social agents, already use this kind of entity if we want to take decision on, for example, climate change, on future pension, or on common health, on our democracy, I would say, at the end of the day. Well, I think that the ontology have to take some position about this kind of entity if we want to refer to this entity. Okay? So past generation, and this is a sort of tentative solution that I want to present to you today. Past generation have had to deal with memory and its devices. Future generation with a sort of predictive form of imagination. So, which means that the present people use different faculties, I would say, in order to create this different notion, because also the ancestors are at the end of the day a form of creation, is a sort of entity which come out from our creativity, I would say. But we use two different types of memories in order to make possible this job. We use memory in order to make and to give a form to our ancestor, and we use a sort of predictive form of imagination in order to imagine future generation. Both concepts have an artifactual nature, in my view. In particular, the notion of ancestor depends weakly on the subjects constructing it, and strongly on the traces that can be found in history, obviously. We put aside the question of interpretation of history because it's take a long time for explanation. Whereas the notion of future generation depends strongly on history and strongly on the subjects constructing it. Both concepts are human constructs in the sense that they are not the result of causal dependence on entity existing in space and time. The result of this process is that the identity of future generation, because as you probably remember, important philosophers like, for example, Derek Parfit, which is a moral philosopher, spent a lot of time in order to explain why we can say a word about the identity of future generation and why we can say a word about the future if you can say a word about the identity of future generation. In my position, this is not a real problem because it's not a real problem to describe a future generation because it's impossible, obviously. But it's an important tool that of using our imagination, starting from the present and in a particular disposition, we say, in order to have some idea about that entity, which is a provisional, obviously, idea. The result of this process is that the identity of future generation will be strongly shaped by the cultural, political, ethical, and economic choices made by previous generation. In this sense, they inherit a world that cannot but influence them in a way, in a very pervasive way. The very problematic entity, considering this question from the point of view of ontology, is obviously the notion of the unborn. Let us therefore examine in particular the concept of the future generation with spatial reference to the unborn. In this sense, future generations are entities that will exist sooner or later. We have an expectation on the fact that the unborn will enter in the cooperation. The future generation that enter into the conceptualization of the transgenerational social action are artifacts characterized primarily by just one property, only one property. Namely, they are possible entities. We know that given the current condition of life on the Earth, this possible entity will eventually exist. This means that when present generation design a transgenerational social action, and my point is that we are in the position of designing this kind of action, and we must oblige to design this kind of action because our society endures during the time, so we cannot avoid to perform this kind of action. This means that when present generation design a transgenerational social action, they refer necessary to this possible entity that are referred to for the successful completion of the action design. Future generations are therefore artifacts that serve a dual purpose. They are functional to the completion of to performing the transgenerational social action. Without this kind of entities, a lot of without this kind of entity, many cooperative action would not be possible, and can be used as normative concepts. So we usually use the unborn and the notion of future generation for both this scope, because we have to perform this action, and without this action, our society would not be in the position to take decision for the long term. And we can use this notion, we are not obliged to do this as normative concept in order to organize this action in a direction instead of another, for example. So how we think to future generation? Using traces from the present, this is the idea. It is clear that we include them in a transgenerational action. It is also clear that we attribute characteristics to them. We imagine them, at least using some properties. And how do we go about attributing this characteristic to them? The idea is that we use our imagination by giving it a predictive form. This is possible because, as for example, sociology suggests, generations succeed each other on the basis of particularly significant events. Why we decide to split living people in, or to describe better, succeeding people using the notion of different generation, because those people are grouped together for using different events that they have about who they have made an experience, for example. So generations succeed each other on the basis of particular significant events that form the common experience of a community in a given time. This make possible to split different generations. My generation, for example, has experienced accelerated forms of communication, such as internet, email, the ability to travel and study freely. Think, for example, to the Erasmus program, a new form of socializing, such as social media. We imagine that future generations will experience the transformation of artificial intelligence, for example. If we have to imagine how future people will live their life, probably we can identify 2 or 3 different relevant experiences that make this way of grouping people possible. So we imagine that future generation will experience the transformation of artificial intelligence, a new way of working, traveling, managing health, and, for example, medical care. They will experience the transformation of the climate and new methods of adaptation. They will experience probably the effects of migration. So the idea is that we have introduced the notion of future generation into social reality precisely to exploit conceptually and empirically the fact that a mental entity, an entity we must adopt to explain long-time action, the unborn, will at some point become a real entity. Such a step creates the expectation the future generation will enter into the dynamic of transgenerational action, continuing the action and concluding the action we, the present generation, decide to perform. The attitude of trust in the work of future generation become this way central. In general, the attitude toward future generation is of two, basically, generally speaking, is of 2 types. In some circumstances, we place on future generation the burden of decision or action that should be taken in the present. This is the case, for example, of action to contain and mitigate the climate crisis. In other circumstances, we commit future generation to action that bind them to decision of previous generation. This is the case with the contraction of public debt. Those examples make, I think, easy the understanding of reason why we have to refer to future generation in order to explain a particular kind of social action. In both circumstances, I'm reaching the end. In both circumstances, we give priority to the needs of the present rather than taking on more articulated and complex situation. In particular, this happens in circumstances in which we oblige future generation to perform action resulting from the decision made by those who precede them. For a moral point of view, however, the common commitment to transgenerational action through recourse to future generation, being the adherence of transgenerational action to the common goal of action into fostering the condition that provide for the possibility of existence of a future generation, according to other principle of social ontology. If just a final remarks to conclude my speech. If you adopt this kind of perspective, which means to enlarge the list of collaborative social action which is offered by standard ontology, and if you enlarge the ontology including non-existing entities like ancestor and unborn in the social ontology, probably it's also useful to change the perspective also in conceiving the unity of the people who make a society, because each of each entity, this is the proposal I'm making, is something which is which has a kind of existence, okay, and that can be conceived as existent when you move the plane of the reflection from social ontology to political philosophy. This is a unity, that of succeeding generation. So I think it's useful to propose to interpret this succession of generation as a sort of single entity, and in some sense as a new object that can be useful, but is another chapter to include in the political philosophy. The unity of generation form, in my view, a sort of civitas, which means a unique object that extends over time and must be considered as an object ontological distinct from the individual generation and individuals that make each generation possible. So considering social reality from this perspective, you have to add to each singular individual not only the generation but also the unity of generation, which make the notion of the people. Okay, I don't like the people because it's it is a concept with a lot of political and ontological implications. So I want to avoid this kind of implication, and I think it's better to use a much more neutral idea like that of the civita. If you put all the generation, if you consider all the of the line of different generation as a sort of existing entity in different way, obviously, you can also move on a different plane, I think, or this is at least my suggestion, on the side of the political dimension. The unity of generation form civitas that extend over time and must be considered as an object ontological distinct from the distinct individual objects. If we understand the civitas as a unity of generation, it is obvious that future generation must be considered as a part of this unity, and that the issues of identifying and representing their interest are at the same time particularly urgent and delicate. I want to stop here because time is running out, and Carola must to enter after me. But I just want to mention a single things that each government, I think, that must be asked from us to elaborate some idea in order to make this representation of future generation as possible using institutional instruments and not just philosophical equipment. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you. Thank you, first of all, for this kind invitation. We are very happy to be here, and also this partnership between the University of Turin and the University of Malta is, I mean, something very precious. And
This is the mic.
Okay, something we are very fantastic. Something we are very happy. My talk concerns meaning and its traces. And the meaning I'm speaking, or I have in mind, is the one we find in literature. Literature and philosophy of language have always had a difficult relationship, and this is what I will mostly focus on. So let's see the plan of the talk. First of all, I will first deal with the relationship between literature and meaning. Then I will focus on that kind of literature which is, or which could be seen as being without meaning. Okay, here I do not have in mind limericks or nonsense, but a specific kind of literature. We will see which is. Maybe you have already understood from the drawing. Then I will try to see if a possible way out is the one coming from distinguishing, by following Paul Grice, sentence meaning from utterer's meaning. I will see what kind of critique of language is at stake. Then I will briefly deal with literature and intentions, literature without speech, and then I will make some final remarks on understanding and appreciating. Okay, let's start with literature and meaning. Okay, as I have told at the beginning, the relationship between literature and meaning is not an easy one. Why? Because even if literature is made up by language, when trying to understand from an analytical point of view the kind of meaning we have to do with, it is not an easy job. Take, for instance, what Gottlob Frege says in Übersinn und Bedeutung, where he explains what is the difference between an ordinary sentence, for instance, the moon is far from Earth, and Odysseus was set ashore at Ithaca while sound asleep. Frege says that in this case, this sentence has no meaning because it has no truth value, because we cannot say if it is true or false. Why? Because Frege says there's no Odysseus, there's no reference, okay? Since there's no Odysseus, we cannot ask whether it is true or false that he was set ashore at Ithaca while sound asleep. So there's no meaning, according to Frege, because there's no truth value. This is a big problem for Russell, okay? Bertrand Russell says, okay, we cannot admit sentences which lack a truth value. Okay, all sentences have a truth value. Bertrand Russell, especially in that chapter whose title is Descriptions, in his Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy, says that we need to understand the kind of names we have to do with. For instance, we need to distinguish Hamlet from Napoleon. Why? Because Russell says, here I'm quoting, to maintain that Hamlet, for example, exists in his own word, namely in the word of Shakespeare's imagination, just as truly as saying Napoleon existed in the ordinary word, is to say something deliberately confusing or else confused to a degree which is scarcely credible. So according to Russell, we need first explain how proper names work, and they do not work as we would intuitively imagine. So they do not refer to that man called Napoleon or that man called Hamlet, because they are sort of shortened versions of definite descriptions. And in the case of Hamlet, since Hamlet does not exist because there is no Prince of Denmark, then we would say that the sentence like, I don't know, Hamlet is the Prince of Denmark is false. So we have the truth value of that sentence. This way of distinguishing ordinary language or standard language and literary language has become somehow quite traditional. Think about Richards and his principles of literary criticism, where he distinguishes the scientific or referential use of language, which is the one having a truth value, from the emotive, poetic use of language, which is internally necessary. This is the coherence Aristotle always remembers in his Poetics, and acceptable. Okay? The point is that according to some philosophers of language, some analytic philosophers, literature has also always been considered as being somehow interesting because it makes possible for us to train in semantics, ontology, metaphysics, exactly as we have done when speaking about Frege's and Russell's positions. Okay. But, and here is my first problem, okay, the one I started with exactly when changing somehow the analytic approach. Is this a good way to approach literature? This was my problem. Because I read these lines by Virginia Woolf in The Second Common Reader, where she writes, "Yet few people ask from books what books can give us. Most commonly we come to books with blurred and divided minds, asking of fiction that it shall be true, of poetry that it shall be false, of biography that it shall be flattering, of history that it shall enforce our own prejudice. If we could banish all such preconceptions when we read, that would be an admirable beginning." So this was my idea, to analyze some literary works, some difficult literary works, because usually analytic philosophers use Sherlock Holmes. Is it true that Sherlock Holmes lived at 221B Baker Street? Is the London of Sherlock Holmes the same London of King Charles? Is Sherlock Holmes famous as Hercule Poirot? And so on and so forth. Okay, these are the standard exercises that we do in semantics, ontology, and so on. But what about those literary works which are more difficult than these ones? Okay, this is not, I mean, I don't want to evaluate Conan Doyle's works. They are fantastic, I love them, but I just want to give a different example, okay? So I would like to work with those literary works that are somehow without meaning, okay? What kind of literary works do I have in mind? I have in mind Beckett's plays, okay? Some Beckett's plays that are particularly interesting to me because they ask somehow to reader not to grasp any meaning. In order to appreciate correctly Samuel Beckett's works, one needs to say, okay, I don't understand, but that's okay. That's the correct appreciation of these works. And this is, of course, intriguing for me. Okay, take, for instance, the beginning of Happy Days, okay? The initial part, in italics, describes the opening scene, which is a desert, where there is a woman buried up to her waist. And here there is a clear reference of Beckett to Le Chien d'Alou by Louis Buñuel, where this very same scene is the last one, when there is Buñuel with Salvador Dalí buried up to their waist. Okay, this is the beginning of Happy Days. This is the description of the scene given by Beckett. We will see how important are captions in Beckett's works. Okay, expanse of scorched grass rising center to low mound, embedded up to above her waist in exact center of mound, Winnie, the protagonist. About 50, well preserved, blonde for preference, plump, arms and shoulders bare, low bodice, big bosom, pearl nickeled. She is discovered sleeping, her arms on the ground before her bed on her arms. Beside her, on ground to her left, a capacious black bag, shopping variety, and to her right, a collapsed parasol, back of handle emerging from seat. To her right and rear, lying asleep on ground, hidden by mound, Willie, the other protagonist. We have just two, Winnie and Willie, wife and husband. Okay, then we have the proper beginning of the play, which is this one. We have a sort of female solo because there are some stage instructions into brackets. And then there are a few words, these are in bold in the text I have put on the slide, by Winnie. Okay, here language is mostly used to describe, instruct, look at the proportions. Okay, how long are the parts describing the scene or giving instructions, and how short are the words told by Winnie. And why, my question is, why does Winnie speak? Let's read what she says. She says, another heavenly day. For Jesus Christ's sake, amen. Word without end, amen. Begin, Winnie. Begin your day, Winnie. Oh, poor Willie, running out, can't be helped. Just one of those old things, another of those old things. Just can be cured, cannot be cured. Oh yes, poor dear Willie. Good Lord, good God, oh well, no better, no worse. And she always does things with her hands, okay, when uttering these words. Okay, here the reader, spectator experiences words, of course, but my question is, does the reader or spectator, because this is a play, that's why I speak about the spectator, but I think, okay, this is not something I will speak about, but I think by following Susan Figgin that plays can be read exactly as they can be performed on the stage. We hear words, we experience words, but we do not grasp a meaning. Okay, these are somehow prayers or recited things she says, but even if she says all these things, nothing happens, okay? If we simply follow what Winnie says and the very short things that Willie answers, we could think that this is, without looking at what is happening on the stage, we could think about somehow a quite normal dialogue in a middle-class couple. Okay, she speaks a lot, and the husband sometimes says, okay, do you think it is so? Okay, this is, she speaks so much, and he has just the function, what we would say that Willie has just the function to render Winnie's not a monologue, okay? But it's not a proper dialogue because there's no exchange between the two. But stage directions and descriptions show us a totally different situation. So the words and the context are totally separated because the context, we would say, does not contribute in any way to determine the meaning of the words. It is likely as if there were a sort of conflict between the two. She says, another heavenly day, but she is buried up to her waist. So what kind of heavenly day she has in mind? So the idea is that Winnie speaks alone. She does not speak to herself, nor to her husband, nor to the audience. Okay, one could say, come on, maybe this is not really a problem. Just remember what Paul Grice says when suggesting to distinguish the sentence meaning from the utterer's meaning. Maybe when uttering, oh, this is a happy day, this will have been another happy day, maybe Winnie wants to be ironic. For instance, when I say, oh, what a nice day, or what a sunny day when it is raining, maybe it is the same thing. But the answer I would give to this suggestion is negative. Because if Winnie wanted to be ironic, she would have a point, a direction, because irony always has a point, a direction. But this is not what happens in Winnie's case, because she does not want to criticize or to implicate anything at all. She's not involved in what Paul Grice calls a cooperative and rational linguistic exchange. All she wants to do is to do something, to say something, not to hear the silence. I think that examples like Happy Days prove that there are literary works losing a proper meaning, or works where the relation between language and meaning is put into question. Of course, if by meaning we understand something that we can grasp when hearing these words, here there's nothing that can be grasped. But if for meaning we intend something more complex, as some continental philosophers do, then, of course, we would say that just understanding linguistically what the text is about is the first step. And then we need to go beyond this first step, somehow trying to understand the topic or the main theme of the literary work. So Happy Days asks this question: how is it possible to describe something with words when that very something seems to defy the possibility of being understood by language? According to me, what happens in examples of this sort is that we have to do with a critique of language. Okay, Beckett was interested in a critique of language. Just remember that for a blind Joyce, Beckett read this interesting and somehow particular work written by Fritz Mautner. Fritz Mautner wrote this Kritik der Sprache. In the Tractatus, Wittgenstein writes that he wants to do that all philosophy is a critique of language. But he says, pay attention, not in Mautner's sense, because what Wittgenstein has in mind is Russell and is this distinction between formal and grammatical, between logic and grammatical form of sentences. But according to Fritz Mautner, the idea is that language is not adequate, is not able to help people communicate. Okay, according to Mautner, language is good for, the shopping list, but not for helping people to understand each other. And this is something that Beckett has strongly put in his works. Okay, first, just also remember how Beckett wanted to feel with the languages he used. Okay, Beckett, at a certain point, and in Happy Days this happened, started to write in French. And when people asked Beckett, but why do you write in French? And his answer was, parce qu'en français c'est plus facile d'écrire sans style, because in French it is easier to write without a style. Okay? He wanted to disappear. We always think about literary language as something which is full of the style of the author. But Beckett was not interested in this at all. And another question interesting is, but then why, if he has such an idea of language, if he is really persuaded that language always fails, why Beckett goes on using language in writing his works. He would maybe his answer was always parce qu'on n'a que ça, because that's all we have. All we have are words. Then even if they always fail, we have anything else. So the idea is that even if language always fails, we need go on using it. And here is this fantastic quote from The Unnameable, where he describes people as these big talking balls, talking about things that do not exist, or that exist perhaps, impossible to know, beside the point. So people using language are nothing other than a voice that speaks, knowing that it lies, indifferent to what it says, knowing itself useless and its uselessness in vain, not listening to itself, but to the silence that it breaks. This is from The Unnameable, okay? So language fails, always fails, but we go on using it. Why? Because we fear silence. We cannot accept silence. Winnie says, oh yes, if only I could bear to be alone, I mean prattle away with not a soul to hear. And she's comforted, of course, by Willie, whose presence has the only function, as I told you before, to transform her monologue in a dialogue. So struggling with language through language and reasoning on the impossibility of communication through dialogues. And this is somehow paradoxical, of course. Let's now try to spend some words on literature and intentions. Okay? It is somehow a shared belief that, however difficult it might be to grasp the meaning of what is told in a literary work, maybe the author is able to tell us which is the meaning of the work he has written. Okay? Take, for instance, this quote from Endgame, where Nell says, nothing is funnier than unhappiness. Okay? We could say, okay, we don't know the meaning of the sentence. It is very difficult to understand what Beckett had in mind when writing it, but hopefully Beckett knew. What grounds this conviction we have? The idea defended, for instance, by actual intentionalists. Here I have in mind, for instance, Noel Carroll. They compare literary works to everyday conversation, and then they defend the idea that when we approach literature, what we need is to understand which are the semantic conventional rules and to grasp the author's intended meaning, as happens in ordinary conversations. Okay? For instance, if now Nikki tells me, okay, Carola, don't you think that it's a bit late? I think that he doesn't really want to inform me about the time it is. Maybe he wants to suggest me, please go to the end of your talk because it's late, okay? And why do I think that? Because there is a sort of cooperation between us, and usually this happens in conversations, okay? Would this help in the case of Beckett? I am not sure, because whereas our ordinary conversation works exactly because it is based on our use of standard language and our cooperating in understanding each other, what happens in literary language is that often ambiguities, mistakes, double senses, failures are characteristics that somehow enrich the literary language, whereas these are always a problem in ordinary communication, okay? Because if now I ask Nikki, what's the time? And the answer is to me, I think that Easter would be a good period for me. then, I mean, I say, okay, my English maybe is bad, but we have really problems understanding each other. Whereas in literature, this could be something interesting, okay? This could be something that we say, okay, wait a moment, why that? Is this a typo? Is there something? What the author wants to say? So that's why, according to me, the conversational hypothesis, even if I see why it could work for some literary works, does not work for all literary works. Because there are cases, as the ones we have been dealing with during my talk, that do not seem to be better understandable by taking something like that into account. Think, for instance, Waiting for Godot, An Attendant Godot, another masterpiece by Beckett, okay? It doesn't properly tell a story. Nothing happens from the first to the second act. Nothing happens, nobody comes, nobody goes, it's awful. It is a masterpiece where the protagonist is absent. Vladimir and Estragon are waiting for him, for Godot, who never comes. There are some possible literary allusions, of course, from Simone Weil's Attends de Dieu, or from Honoré de Balzac, Le Faiseur, or Mercadet. But even having in mind these possible literary allusions, we wouldn't be helped in better understanding the literary work at all. And also, when asked Beckett, but did you mean by Godot God? Did you want to say that Godot is God? And the answer by Beckett was, the play tells what it says. If it speaks about Godot, if I wanted to speak about God, I would have written God, but I haven't written God, so it speaks about Godot, okay? So there's no possibility to have something more, okay, by going somehow in interpretation or whatever. There is also this quote by Molloy, again about language. Not to want to say, not to know what you want to say, not to be able to say what you think you want to say, and never to stop saying, or hardly ever. That is the thing to keep in mind, even in the head of composition. So, language is used as a means of saying that language in literature is meaningless. And in this inability, somehow, I think that there is the power of Beckett's literary works. In the last part of his production, as maybe you know, Beckett decides to propose a literature without speech, without language. So language disappears from his works. In Act Without Words, what we have is just a list of instructions in order to put the work on the stage, but where dialogues or even anything uttered by the protagonist is absent, okay? What happens in Act Without Words is that there is a male character on a deserted stage obeying to the stimulus of whistle blows. And the difference in the function of the whistle blow corresponds to a difference in situation. The side the whistles engage the protagonist in spatial considerations by which he knows the limits of the area in which he moves, and the whistle blows from above indicate to him the objects he can dispose of within the area assigned to him. The whistle from above triggers a complex series of situations and decisions. So what we have in Actes sans parole is the caption, as we have seen is present also in Happy Days, for instance. Here, the language used also for these instructions is totally devoid of what Frege would have called the tone and color of the language, the texture of the language, okay? The language present in these works is simple. Adjectives are mostly definers. The adjectives it uses are very, very simple ones. Just right, left, little, big, alone, thin. And what Beckett wants to do here is to give nothing but instructions, okay? So, and the meaning of the play emerges from the absence of any meaning that we get from this instruction booklet. Okay, the last part of my talk has to do with understanding and appreciating. Okay, how to understand literary works or plays that ask spectators and readers not to understand. I think that the power of these literary works is to show the failure of language and to show what happens when silence proves to be the only alternative, but the characters are unable to accept this silence. Even in actes en parole, there is this whistleblowers, okay? Silence is never possible because humans are not able to accept silence. How much this tells us about communication, about real communication, not literary one. And what is the difference about speaking of nothing, as Winnie does? For Jesus Christ's sake, come. And she put things in her bags, and she put things out of her bag, and there is a revolver, there is things for, there is something to, for, I mean, there are all these things she always has in her hands, and she speaks just to hear something, to hear a voice. So then, is language able to help us or not? Or by using Beckett's words, what is a word? What is the function of language? And this was the last question Beckett asked. Okay, the last work he wrote before dying was the one titled, "What is the word?" Okay? And it was such a difficult work because even the publishers, the Minuit, the French one, and Calder, the English one, did not know the kind of literary genre it belonged to. Okay? According to the French ones, this was poetry. According to Calder, it was prose. Okay? They do not know what this is. He asks, what is the word? Seeing all this, all this here. Folly for to see what, glimpse, seem to glimpse, need to seem to glimpse, a faint, a far away, over there what? Folly for to need to seem to glimpse, a faint, a far away, over there what is the word? And no answer is possible. No answer is possible. And this is the very last question. What about understanding? What about understanding if we do not even grasp the meaning of words, and if we're even unable to answer the question, what is a word? Okay, there is a huge debate in philosophy of literature concerning the cognitive value of literary works, okay? I know that, this is a huge debate, and of course literary works are so different ones from the other. For instance, by reading, I don't know, Anna Karenina, I can learn that in the Russian society of that period, people used to speak French. Or I can learn that divorce was possible in the Russia of that years. This is something that we surely learn from literature. But the question at the basis of this debate is there something that we genuinely learn thanks to literature? Okay? Tamar Gendler distinguishes between a narrative as a clearinghouse and narrative as a factory. The first kind, narrative as a clearinghouse, concerns those kind of things that we export from literary works. Okay, for instance, the ones that in French in Russia, rich people used to speak French to each other. But there is another kind of learning from literature that is the one she calls narrative as a factory. And in that case, what happens is that we activate a sort of inferential process, okay? This means that we export something from the story, but this is not what is really relevant. What is relevant is that we somehow think about the story and understand something new thanks to it. And I would say that in the case of Beckett, what we learn, of course, is not narrative as a clearinghouse, okay? Because they do not tell anything at all, okay? In Godot, nothing happens. In Happy Days, nothing happens as well, okay? But maybe it is at stake something like narrative as a factory. Why? Because what we understand, thanks to Beckett's works, is to grasp, for instance, what is the passing of time, okay? Time passes. We become aware of its inevitability, okay? There's nothing we can do. Time passes. And there is a sort of overlap between past and present, and we cannot stop this. We can also think about what we have been talking about when commenting Happy Days, for instance, that maybe we do not always speak in order to communicate, that sometimes we really are these big talking balls speaking about things that do not exist. And we speak just because we are unable to keep silent, because we fear being silent, because it is something that makes us feel embarrassed, maybe. When there is also people, and this is something we find in Beckett as well, that speaks. Some speak always also when they are alone. So it is not something having to do with the problems we may encounter in the relationship with others, but also when we are alone, we are unable to keep silent because we do not want maybe to stay alone with ourselves. Maybe we can also learn something when reading Beckett about loneliness or about those dialogues that are nothing but monologues. So it seems that what we understand is something that we could label traces of meaning. So there's a meaning. We are trained with meaning. We are trained to understand meaning from when we were kids. So meaning is something we need, we look for, and we look for meaning even when what we have are just traces of meaning, maybe remembrance of meaning. But when meaning maybe is lost. Is this a problem? For ordinary language, of course, this is a big problem. This is a big problem because language is important for us. Just remember that we are the only animals able to use language. Okay, so for ordinary language, for ordinary communication, this is a big problem, but not for literature. Because for literature, I would say that even if language fails, art can triumph. So that's it. Thank you.